Hi, Andrea. Thank you for having me. Thanks to WePlanet for the invitation. So, yeah, very happy to talk about this topic. It's my favourite topic to talk about. It's a good way to spend a Sunday afternoon. I took the liberty of adding an extra word though. So the topic I think as advertised was sustainable water management for cities. I threw in and resilient because I think they're both worth talking about. They're related concepts, but somewhat different. And so I want to talk about how we design cities and water supplies for cities that are both sustainable and resilient. So, and I'm in Sydney. I'm going to use the example of Sydney, some of the experiences that we've had and some of the planning that we've been doing for future water supplies. So a few of these charts are taken from a document called the Greater Sydney Water Strategy, which was produced by the New South Wales Government in 2021, looking at our plan for the next 40 years of supplying water. And this first chart actually shows the total inflow into Sydney storages. So most of our water is stored in large dams, mostly Warragamba Dam, and the amount of water that we have is a function of how much water flows into the waterways that lead into those dams. And so these are the annual inflows from 1909 through to 2020. First thing that you can see is that it's highly variable. We have wet years and we have very dry years. A few other things to see though, that if you look at the moving average, or if you look at the average over a long period of time, it shows there the average from 1909 to 2020 as the green line, about 1,400 gigalitres per year inflows. But we appear to have had a step change like many cities in Australia, most severe being Perth. But if you look at the more recent average, just 1991 to 2020, that average is only 770 gigalitres per year. So we did, it's a bit biased actually, we did have a very wet year in 2020 well, that wet year is captured there. So we had some floods in 2020, we had that very wet year, but generally we have had decreased on average inflows into Sydney's water supplies. So what we want to think about is if we want a sustainable and reliable water supply, how much water can we reliably produce from this system? And that's a function of how much water comes in, but also losses. We have to maintain environmental flows. We have evaporation. If some of the water comes in when the dams are already full, it will spill. So not all of that water is available to supply, and it's estimated somewhere between 515 to 540 gigalitres per year of water can be supplied from Sydney's current system. If we have a look at demand, how much water we actually use, demand has changed over the last 30 years as well, from 1990 to 2020. The red line here is actually population. So population has grown. But if you look at these grey coloured sections here, these are periods of drought when we were on water restrictions. So this is the demand, the blue line, and you can see that going back to the early 90s, demand was up above 600 gigalitres per year. We went into the millennium drought and we all went on water restrictions, and that was very effective that was before the millennium drought, a drought in the early 90s. We're on water restrictions, and that was effective in reducing demand temporarily, and then it bounced back. And then we got to another drought, the millennium drought in the early 2000s, where we not only had water restrictions, we had campaigns to start building a water efficient infrastructure. So putting in things like low flow shower heads, dual flush toilets, and through the combination of new infrastructure going in, not just in residential properties, but also in commercial and industrial water users, combination of restrictions and new infrastructure, we managed to bring demand down very low, below 500 gigalitres per year for a time. And then the drought ended, and everybody just assumed that we would bounce back again to where we were, but we didn't bounce back. And the reason is because we put in low flow shower heads, we put in water efficient washing machines, we had a new labelling scheme and new standards around water efficiencies for lots of white goods, in fact. And we didn't just rip those out again. out at the end of the drought. So we actually maintained a higher level of water efficiency than we had prior to the millennium drought. And our total water use has gradually just gone up since then, more or less in line with population growth. So we never saw that bounce back. One of the things that means is we probably don't have that opportunity to do that again now, because we are more water efficient per person than we were, and it's difficult to grab those same benefits a second time around. But what we notice now, that if we're looking at current demand, we're about 550 gigalitres per year, which is slightly more than what we saw on the previous chart, 515 to 540 of available supply. So we already think that on average, we're using more water than we can reliably supply over the long term. So we need to think about future water resources in Sydney. But even more important than that, during 2019 to 2020, 2017 to 2020, we went into a very severe drought. So this is showing our storage percentages, storage as a relative to 100% of capacity in our dams. Here's the millennium drought. And if you look at the millennium drought, Sydney's dams dropped by about 50% of capacity over 4 years, from about 2001 to 2005, let's say. We dropped by 50% of capacity. We thought that was the worst drought on record. It was. That was the worst drought we'd experienced. But then from 2017 to 2020, we also dropped 50% of capacity, but we did it in 2.5 years. And this was a real shock. This really showed us that suddenly we can run out of water very, very quickly. If we can lose 50% in 2.5 years, if we have a drought that lasts 3 years, 4 years, we will really be in very dire straits as far as water supply availability goes in Sydney. So we're very susceptible to drought. That means that looking at long-term average yields isn't very helpful, because those long terms are made up of severe droughts and severe floods. The averages are made up of severe droughts and severe floods, and that's not the way that we want to manage water supplies in Sydney. So the Greater Sydney Water Strategy started to look at what are some of the characteristics of water supply in Sydney and how does it compare to other cities around Australia. And there's a parameter that we started to look at more closely that hadn't really been in focus previously, and that's this one. It's the percentage of total demand, total water use, that can be met through rainfall independent water supply. So not just the water that's coming from rain and running into dams. So really what that means is a combination of seawater desalination is independent of rainfall, and recycled water, taking water from wastewater treatment plants and treating that and reusing it for various purposes. And we'll talk a little bit about it further in. But if you have a look at this chart, compared to Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide, Sydney can only supply about 20% of our total demand through rainfall independent supplies, 15% from desalination and about another 5% from some small recycling schemes, compared to cities like Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide that can supply more than 30-40% of what they need through rainfall independent supplies. So that really buffers them against the weather. They go through periods of drought and they're much more resilient to drought because they can still continue to supply a larger proportion of the water that they need. So we now have at least 6, depending on what you count, but 6 major seawater desalination plants operating or able to operate around Australia. So one on the Gold Coast, Sydney's, Melbourne, Adelaide, and 2 in Western Australia serving Perth. And they started being built just after the millennium drought, so operating. The Perth was the first in 2006, but all of those plants built not too long after that, and they can supply about 15 to 40% of local drinking water supply, and they provide that drought resilience when they're needed. Thinking about sustainability, one of the big issues that often comes up with seawater desalination is the energy intensity, and I did see a comment pop up about nuclear powered desal, which is certainly one option. When these plants were constructed, there was a lot of concern about energy intensity and the associated greenhouse footprint, given that all of our energy grids are dominated by fossil fuel combustion. And one of the ways that the various state governments dealt with that, and this is the example from Sydney, the New South Wales government put in place a requirement within the planning approval to say that for when Sydney's seawater desalination plant was going to be built, they have to they have to purchase renewable credits to offset the power use. So a specified outcome that the desalination plant will be powered 100% by renewable energy or equivalent, purchased using green power or equivalent. And that purchase in Sydney came from a wind farm, the wind farm down at Bungendore, the one that Joe Hockey says is an eyesore. But it really kick-started, it provided a major baseload customer to that wind farm. So it's a little bit like a shopping centre. When you think about a shopping centre, you really need your big anchor customers, the anchor shops in there, the Woolworths and the Coles, in order for that shopping centre to be viable for the smaller shops to come along and lease the smaller shop fronts. So it was the same with Sydney Desalination Plant, providing that big anchor customer to that particular wind farm. And continues to purchase energy from that wind farm. It's a take or pay contract. The desal plant, even during those years when the desal plant wasn't operated, had to purchase that power, and so maintained that customer demand on the Bungendore wind farm. During that period when they weren't operating, they simply on-sold that energy, sometimes for a profit, in fact. So similar arrangements were put in place for seawater desalination plants all around Australia. So the Gold Coast, Perth, the Wonthaggi plant in Victoria, it supplies Melbourne, the desal plant in South Australia. They all had different arrangements in place, but they are all effectively, when they were first established, required to purchase renewable energy offsets. And so that's had a big impact on supporting the development of renewable energy in Australia. So thinking about other cities then that are inland, don't have easy access to seawater desalination. It's very expensive to pump water long distances, so they need to look at alternative solutions. And one alternative that has been developed over recent years is, this example is from Orange City Council in New South Wales, where they're taking urban stormwater. So water that has landed on the streets and the roads and the footpaths, and on the roofs of houses, and run off down through downpipes into gutters, and collected in what's called the East Orange Creek that runs through, as you can see, a very urban part of town. They take that urban stormwater when it rains, they store it they've got a small storage, a small lagoon, where they actually do some treatment in that lagoon. And then this is Orange's main drinking water supply, Suma Park Dam, it's called, and they can pump water from this stormwater system into Suma Park Dam. Why is that useful in drought? In drought, it actually rains. People will remember it often rains during drought, but often we don't get any benefit to the dams. We don't get inflow into the dams during drought because the soil is so dry, it soaks up all the water like a sponge, and then when it stops raining, it all evaporates from the soil. It dries out the soil, so you don't actually generate that runoff. However, an urban catchment like this does generate runoff even in a small rainfall event, because you have impervious surfaces. Footpaths and roads don't soak up the water the same way that soil in a traditional catchment does. So often you get water out of a system like this during a drought, during small to medium rainfall events, when you don't get water from a conventional drinking water catchment. And here's the Mayor of Orange during the last drought saying exactly that. In September, we had below average rainfall because of the drought. That rain soaked into the parched paddocks and there was no normal runoff, but with our stormwater harvesting, we could collect runoff from streets and parks, and from those two rain events, we were able to harvest 8 days of water. Not a massive amount, but more than what they got from any other source at that time. Another good example to look at, so this is something I took off Twitter, as you can see, a few years ago during the drought in 2019, where this lady, Dr. Manu Saunders, had posted something. She'd just gotten into an aeroplane over Armidale and snapped this photo out the window of the drought, showing how dry and parched the land around is. But the only green spot on the landscape, as she pointed out, was the sewage treatment plant. And it's a reminder that that's a source of water that is reliable. Even during drought, people still flush toilets and have baths and showers. They might be shorter, but sewage still flows. So lots of towns and cities have made use of that point, started to tap into wastewater from the sewage treatment plant, particularly during drought, but often continuously, and have been using that to irrigate, for example. This is Wagga City Council that use about 6 gigalitres a year of treated wastewater to irrigate the local football ground and cricket ground, thereby keeping those important community assets operational during periods of drought when they otherwise wouldn't be if they were on severe water restrictions. So there's been a trend to look at more ways to be able to make more use of wastewater from sewage treatment plants, water that had previously gone to waste. And we see this example from Perth now in Western Australia, where they take wastewater from their wastewater treatment plant, the secondary effluent, so that's just conventionally treated wastewater that would normally be discharged to the environment, and they treat that water by advanced treatment processes. These stand for ultrafiltration, reverse osmosis, and UV disinfection. In Perth, they don't actually store a lot of water in dams, in surface water. They store it underground. They have aquifers under Perth that the drinking water is supplied from. So that's actually where they store this advanced treated water. They pump it underground into the same aquifer that supplies the drinking water for the city. And by doing that, they're able to reuse more of the water because it's not seasonal like irrigating sports fields. You use lots of water in the summer, but you can't use it all in the winter, so you don't get the maximum use from the water that's available. So in this case, they can store it and they can reuse a larger proportion of the water, thereby topping up Perth's drinking water supplies. Stage one of that scheme was built in 2017 to supply about 40 megalitres per day. That's not a huge amount. It's probably 5% of Perth's drinking water. Stage two of this slide's a little bit old. It's now operating. It was doubled in size about a year ago to 80 megalitres per day. And the Water Corporation in Perth estimate that they should be able to supply well over 300 megalitres per day of water through purified recycled water by 2060. So it's a very important future source of water. Similarly, in Queensland, the Western Corridor Recycled Water Scheme, there was a scheme built to take water from wastewater treatment plant, from 6 wastewater treatment plants, in fact, in this case, and to treat that at 3 advanced water treatment plants, one at Bundamba, one at Luggage Point, one at Gibson Island, using advanced treatment processes, ultrafiltration, reverse osmosis, UV hydrogen peroxide, it's an advanced oxidation process, and then chlorine disinfection, and then putting that back into their storage, which is a lake. So Lake Wivenhoe is the main storage for Brisbane, for southeast Queensland. This scheme has been built, but it's never actually put the water back into Lake Wivenhoe for much the same reason that Sydney's desal plant didn't operate for a decade. The lake's been full and they've had floods and they haven't had anywhere to put that water. But it is still part of southeast Queensland's future water supply strategy. That when it's needed, that scheme is ready to go to top up Lake Wivenhoe with purified recycled water. Sydney also has purified recycled water. We don't talk about it very much. Often it's not acknowledged for what it is, but we certainly take water from 3 sewage treatment plants, Penrith, St Mary's and Quakers Hill sewage treatment plants. They go to an advanced water treatment plant with the same technologies. These are the reverse osmosis membranes. And that purified water is then released into the Hawkesbury Nepean River, where it flows about 17 kilometres downstream, and it gets taken out again at the North Richmond water filtration plant, and it becomes part of the drinking water supply for northwest Sydney. So there are lots of different ways that we can take water that would have been wastewater, would have been just discharged into the environment, and can purify that and reuse it. Some work that was done by a consultancy company a couple of years ago, GHD, I won't get bogged down in the details, but they were effectively trying to compare different ways of supplying water, seawater desalination, using recycled water through indirect potable reuse, which means putting it back into a dam or an aquifer, as we looked at, using recycled water through direct potable reuse, which means just pumping it straight back to houses, and some of these non-potable supplies like irrigating local playing fields, but also delivering water back to houses. And there are lots of examples. There are a number of examples of those around Australia now. So I won't go into the details, but the point that they were trying to show is that we can compare these different options. First of all, in terms of energy consumption, seawater desalination is a very energy intensive process, and therefore it's expensive because the major operational cost is electricity. Indirect potable reuse, pumping water back into a dam, is also relatively energy intensive, but only about half as energy intensive as seawater desalination. So if you've got the choice, often recycling is a more attractive option. And if you can go straight back to houses, if you don't have to go into a dam or an aquifer, we're not at that point in Australia yet, but that's potentially even more attractive from an energy and cost perspective. Using water for non-drinking purposes to irrigate the local sports ground is even less energy intensive because you don't have to treat the water to the same degree, and you don't also can use it more locally. You don't have to pump it back to a major storage. So that looks attractive from this perspective, but then when you look at the materials that go into building these schemes, it's the dual pipe schemes that don't stack up so well because you've got to replicate the pipe system. You've got to deliver new pipes to all of the houses, etc. So these are the sorts of considerations we think about when we're thinking about which of the different options are going to be attractive from an energy consumption and an energy cost and materials cost perspective. So the last few things I wanted to talk about relate more to resilience and thinking about how a number of water supply systems around Australia stacked up during the severe droughts that we had from 2017 to early 2020, the Black Summer bushfires that immediately followed that in the first month or two of 2020, and the floods that immediately followed the fires in February 2020, Black Summer bushfires starting before Christmas, of course, and then the floods. So looking at impacts from all of those different types of events. So fire certainly damaged lots of water supply infrastructure, lots of storages, lots of dams, and the infrastructure around those dams, the pipelines, etc., were damaged on the east coast of Australia and South Australia. Water treatment plants were directly impacted by fires. Electrical supplies go out. Once power poles start coming down, it's hard to get electricity to water treatment plants, and without power, most of them can't operate. Fuel generators often were left isolated and ran out of fuel and couldn't be refueled and restarted. You also lose a lot of the communications once the communication towers, mobile phone networks start going down. We stop being able to access data and operational interfaces for water treatment plants. So a lot of water treatment plants found it difficult to continue to supply safe drinking water during the fires, and these are a few of the examples. So we certainly had boil water alerts at the places that I've indicated here, in some cases because the water treatment plant just simply wasn't operating, or it had to be bypassed. The water treatment plant couldn't supply water fast enough for the extra demand that had been imposed because of people trying to fight fires and leaving sprinklers running on their roofs as they evacuated communities. So water treatment plants were bypassed due to an inability to keep up with demand. This happened at Maruya and Tilba. I'll talk about the Shoalhaven up here in a moment. In a couple of places, the actual water treatment plant, the infrastructure was damaged by fire, and so we couldn't guarantee that we were supplying safe drinking water to people in some of these smaller southern New South Wales communities. And loss of power supplies also impacted the ability to provide safe drinking water in a couple of cases. Then came the flood after the fire. The fires had damaged the catchments, so a lot of the trees had been burnt in the catchments. So when you don't have trees and you don't have that ground cover, the catchment becomes very prone to erosion. So you have a big rainfall event and all of the soil starts washing away into the waterways, and not just the soil, but all of the ash from the fires themselves, which are sitting on the ground now. So that's what happened. We had intense rainfall events washing ash and mud, eroded soil into waterways. So this is showing that after the fire came the flood. This is the river flow here. So we have this high river flow happening, and then high turbidity, all of this sediment coming down the river, high nitrogen and phosphorus afterwards. So this is high levels of nutrients, which leads to potential future water quality impacts, and high levels of dissolved organic carbon. The dissolved organic carbon and the turbidity in particular make it really hard to treat the water, and therefore to be able to deliver water to customers that's safe to drink. And we had several schemes that failed to be able to do that during the fires. This is the example from Brogo Dam down at Bermagui. This is the water quality that was coming down that system. It's chocolate milk. It's completely impenetrable to look through. If you have a look at the Brogo Dam, so here's the dam wall here. There's a water treatment plant just downstream somewhere. It takes water from the dam wall. They treat the water. It might be up in here somewhere. All of this area up here was burnt. So this was all the damaged catchment in here. So this is where we had all of the mud and everything coming into the Brogo River. So this is what we call a run of the river, or a river impoundment supply. So this dam wall here is just literally a wall across the river. So whatever comes down the river is what gets caught as the supply here, and that's the water that becomes available. And there's no opportunity to be able to manage that water or to avoid the poor quality water in this case. Compare that, for example, to Coffs Harbour. Coffs Harbour also had serious bushfires upstream at Dorrigo. And this river here, the Orara River, runs down from the Dorrigo region in the west of Coffs Harbour past Coffs Harbour. This is Coffs Harbour's water supply, Karangi Dam. And the thing you notice about it is here's the river, right, along here, and here's the dam. It's completely different to the Brogo Dam. We don't have, the river doesn't run into the dam. It's a separate, what we call an off-stream storage. So the way this dam is operated is we pump water from the river into Karangi Dam. And the advantage of doing that is you only pump when you've got good water quality, and it's one way of managing water quality in that dam. So when those fires were on and all of the ash and sediment was coming down the river, the pumps simply didn't operate, and we didn't end up with poor water quality in this dam. It continued down the Orara River and ultimately into the Nimboida and off into the Clarence system. So this is an example of what I want to talk about, which is about flexibility, being able to change the way that you operate the system under certain challenging conditions. For the Brogo Dam, you can't do that. Whatever water's coming down the system is the water that you get. For the Karangi Dam, you can at least turn the pumps on and turn the pumps off as needed. Same thing happened in Shoalhaven. Shoalhaven was in really terrible state during those fires. So this is the Shoalhaven River. The city of Nowra is down there somewhere. Nowra, oh, here it is. Nowra is supplied from the Shoalhaven River. Upstream, the catchment was severely burnt, just like Sydney's drinking water catchment. All of these red circles here show where it was burnt. There's a storage here called Talawa Dam, which also supplies Sydney, but releases water down the Shoalhaven River. And given that all of this catchment was burnt, there's no way that the small water treatment plant that supplies Nowra and these other suburbs, other towns, could have continued to operate had it not been for the fact that they had a couple of small off-river supplies. So they could pump water out of the Shoalhaven River before the worst water quality came down the river, and then use this water in these off-river supplies. They're very small, so the Shoalhaven region nearly did run out of water, but it got them through the worst of that period. So again, it's about flexibility. It's about being able to change the way the system operates when things go wrong. Here's Warragamba Dam, Sydney's main water supply in about February 2020. During those floods, just after the bushfires, you can see the ash and the sediment, the organic carbon that's in the water behind the dam wall. In this case, that water that's on the surface there is effectively untreatable. You try and filter that water and it just clogs up the filters, so you can't produce clean drinking water at any reasonable rate to meet the demand of the city when the water looks like that. Fortunately, we had some flexibility in Sydney that we could tap into in order to be able to continue to provide good drinking water. Nobody in Sydney noticed any drinking water quality impact during this event, although we were flying very, very close to having major water quality problems in Sydney. So what were we able to do to prevent there being an impact at customer taps? The first source of flexibility that Sydney has is being able to adjust the offtake level that they take water from the dam wall. So if this is Warragamba Dam wall and this is all the water behind it, we can actually take water from close to the surface, or we can take water from a bit further down, or we can take water from much deeper down. Usually we avoid what's on the surface because there's a bit of algae up there. Usually we avoid what's down deep because sometimes you don't have very high oxygen concentrations and metals and things start to dissolve into the water. Usually there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle, but in this case, when the whole top half of the dam was full of mud, we were able to adjust the offtake to further down and take deeper water, and thereby avoiding the worst quality water to send to the water treatment plant for Sydney. But another really important source of flexibility in Sydney is the fact that this is our main water treatment plant, Prospect Water Filtration Plant. This is Warragamba, the main storage, but the one that we saw was in very poor condition at this time. Sydney has what looks like a pretty complex network. We've got a whole bunch of other dams further down, which we can bring water up from. We've got the seawater desalination plant that we can bring water in from. So it means that we actually have the flexibility to be able to pick and choose where water comes from that arrives at Prospect Water Filtration Plant. The desal plant itself can't deliver water to Prospect Water Filtration Plant, but it can deliver water to the same suburbs that Prospect delivers water to, thereby taking the demand off that particular plant. So all of these dams down here, Nepean, Avon, Cordo, Cataract, they're all much smaller than Warragamba, but they all become really important when we start talking about resilience of the system. So for that reason, it's really important to protect all of the catchments. Where it's a controversial issue is that we have mining in some of those catchments in southern Sydney. It is impacting water quality, and the more we let that water quality degrade, the less resilience we're going to have, because the less we're going to be able to rely on those southern dams as the alternative source when we need it. So some cities, such as Southeast Queensland, have built resilience by building flexibility. So Southeast Queensland now has what they call the SEQ water grid, where they can pump water from the Gold Coast into Brisbane. They can use Brisbane's traditional sources like Wivenhoe, and they can also transfer water from the northern suburbs as well, the Sunshine Coast. So by having some sort of a grid where you can move water around provides flexibility, and that flexibility provides resilience. There are other regional systems that do a similar thing, such as water sharing between Coffs Harbour and Grafton. This is the last slide I'll show. So this is from the Lower Hunter Water Security Plan. It's Newcastle's plan for future water supplies going forward from 2022 onwards. And as you can see, what they're trying to do is they're trying to build in rainfall independent supply. So a seawater desalination plant being built at Belmont. They're building in flexibility. So this is a connection between two surface water systems that enables them to store water and move water between those systems. And that flexibility actually provides access to more water by doing that. And then further into the future, looking around early 2040s, the plan is that they will have purified recycled water schemes up and running, supplying water for the Lower Hunter for Newcastle as well. And that is the formal plan of the government. That's looking like it is the most realistic, the most sustainable plan that is available, having gone through many options to get to this point. And in fact, this is very timely because it was just this week. In fact, I think it was just yesterday or the day before that planning approval from the New South Wales government was announced to build this Belmont desalination plant, seawater desalination plant. So right now, Newcastle is taking that next step towards future water supply security and sustainability. And I hope that we'll see some sort of renewable energy contract written into the requirement, planning requirement written into that final approval as well. That's all I've got. Happy to take any questions if I've left time.